What does the future of education look like? At Matchbook Learning, we dream of designing the future of education. But where do you start? We would argue that you would start at the very bottom. The very worst performing public schools in our country that are serving our most desperate children. And why start there? If we don't design a system that meets the needs of those children, we'll never have a future education system that meets the needs of all children. But what does the bottom look like? Brenda Scott is a K-8 school in Detroit, Michigan. If you were to visit this school, you'd immediately be impressed by the architecture. Amazing, impressive, expansive, modern. But the building doesn't tell the whole story. You see, last year before we arrived, out of 832 students, only 7 were proficient in either reading or math. 7. Now, if you think I'm over-dramatizing the impact of public education and its current state in this country by pulling this one example, consider this, that we could have gone to any zip code in America that's in the bottom 25% income-wise, and the chances of those kids getting a college degree by age 25 is just 9%. The number of schools like Brenda Scott that are chronically failing are projected to reach 20,000 in number in just 2 years. And in 2 years, an amazing thing will happen. For the first time in our nation's history, we'll adopt a single set of national education standards called the Common Core. And these Common Core standards will be benchmarked to the very best in the world, to education systems like Singapore and South Korea, Finland. And what do you think is going to happen to the number of chronically failing schools when we significantly raise the bar on what our kids are expected to learn and to know in order to be internationally competitive? The number of turnaround schools is likely to skyrocket. But these schools in these bottom 25% zip codes are trapped inside cycles of poverty, homelessness, abandonment. Is it fair to ask any school to overcome these gravitational forces? I could show you many images like this one that surround our schools, but that would be an incomplete story. I'd rather show you an image of inside the school. You see, inside the 4 walls, you get a different image. You get hope. You get kids like Jalen, a 5th grader, who dreams of one day becoming a CIA agent. He wants to be a patriot and defend our country. Jalen doesn't know that statistically, he's got a 9% chance of making his dream. So the future of education rests for us on one single question. How do we help Jalen? I don't mean how do we help him in a one-off way. How do we help him systemically so that every Jalen in every zip code not only dreams their dream, but realizes their dream? In order to understand our future, we have to go back to the past. The picture on the left is a 1913 classroom. The picture on the right is a 2013 classroom. Side by side, there's a 100-year difference between these two pictures, and yet, very little else differs. In both pictures, students are grouped by age. They sit in rows. A teacher lectures them through a printed curriculum, moving them at the same pace, sequence, and learning style. I dare you to find another industry that has changed so little in 100 years. In fact, we know in the last 10 years alone, technology has completely disrupted entire industries with companies like Google and Facebook. They're leveraging technology to transform industries. So what about technology transforming education? Well, there's been some. Obviously, smart boards have replaced chalkboards. We have computers and computer labs. But if we're honest, it really hasn't transformed teaching and learning. And the minute we push this conversation a little bit further about how technology could play a role in the classroom, parents and policymakers alike become concerned that we're creating too disconnected of a system. We don't want robots teaching our kids. We don't want our kids becoming robots. And so we're wrestling with this question. What about great teaching? Well, there's a lot of debate around how to fix public education. One thing that isn't debatable, that the research undeniably supports, is the impact of quality education, quality teaching. The single most important determinant of your child's academic success isn't technology, isn't poverty or economic or family background. It's the quality of the teacher that stands in front of him or her. Think about that. Quality teaching trumps poverty. Benjamin Bloom, a researcher, 30 years ago did some amazing research that actually provides us a clue, a window on what the future of education could look like. He studied a group of elementary students that were being taught in a conventional class, one teacher, 30 kids. At the end of the unit, they were assessed, and not surprising, there was a bell curve of performance on that assessment. He ran a second experiment, this time, similar students, same content, but and still one teacher to 30 students. But now, instead of just doing an assessment at the end, they did assessments throughout as the material was being taught to see if the kids had mastered what they had learned. If they did, they moved forward. If they didn't, they'd repeat. Under this mastery-based approach, these students outperformed their conventionally taught peers by an entire standard deviation. He ran the experiment a third time. And this time, what he did was, in addition to this mastery-based approach of frequent assessments, he gave every student their individual tutor, a college student. And in this one-to-one mastery-based environment, these students outperformed their conventionally taught peers by 2 standard deviations. Now think about what Bloom stumbled upon. By simply changing the delivery of instruction to be more of a one-to-one mastery-based environment, 96% of those students outperformed their conventionally taught students. Bloom's solution is elegant, simple, it's beautiful. But unfortunately for us, it's not scalable. We can't give every student their own teacher. We couldn't financially afford it, and even if we could, where would we find the teachers? So we come back to this question, what should we do for Jalen? On the one hand, you have technology transforming entire industries, and yet there's obvious constraints and challenges around how we do that in education. On the other hand, you have this compelling research that says the impact of a teacher on a child's learning, and yet there's constraints and challenges around how we scale great teaching. Maybe the answer isn't either technology or great teaching. Maybe it's a both and, that intersection, the blend of great technology and great teaching, or what we would call a blended model of school. You see, in a traditional classroom, we start the year in September. Let's say it's a 4th grade class, and we move that class through in a linear fashion through a 4th grade curriculum, assess them at the end of the year, assuming that they have mastered that 4th grade material in a linear fashion and are ready to go on to the 5th grade. But if we assess those kids at the beginning of the year in September, in Jalen's school, we would find, and many schools like it, these kids aren't ready for the 4th grade. They're 1 or 2 or multiple years behind. And if all we do is move them through a 4th grade curriculum, we'll find at the end of the year, they're not ready to advance. So rather than optimize this broken system, we decided to blow it up. Metaphorically speaking. We went into Jalen's school, and we created every classroom to be a blended classroom, and here's a picture of that. Every student has their own individual learning path. Let me deconstruct this classroom for you. In the classroom, there are 4 distinct groups. Along the far left of the classroom are a group of students that are working individually on their computers. They could be listening to an online lecture, doing a game-based problem, reading a narrative. There's a group at the back that are working intensively with the teacher. The teacher's giving direct instruction from him or her. This is a group that may be behind the curve. There's a group in the middle that has gone through the first 2 groups and are now applying what they've learned, demonstrating mastery. They could be doing group work or project work, writing an essay, doing a scientific experiment. And finally, there's a 4th group along the far wall that are now online assessing what they just learned in those different rotation groups to confirm that they in fact learned it, but also to extend their learning curve to figure out now what do they do next. You can see how this model would be great for students. Different modes of instruction, meeting them where they are, different pacing. But how does a teacher begin to teach in this environment? In the old way, they knew what they were going to teach on Monday, they knew what they were going to teach on Tuesday. Now you've got kids at different paces, taking assessments at different times, each with their own individual learning path and learning style. At Matchbook Learning, we do 3 things with these teachers to not only enable them to teach in a blended classroom, but to thrive in it. First, we give them real-time data on each student. They pull up a dashboard on their computer, and they can see every student plotted, both on their current performance and on their year-to-date performance. Now, we obviously want to optimize both of those axes, but the reality is kids accelerate and decelerate their learning at different times, get stuck and unstuck at different points in the curriculum. And so what we do with this data is we can see trends. And on that real-time data, we give them real-time feedback. What instructional strategies are working well with which groups? Which kids are working well with what instructional strategies? And then the third thing we do is we sit down with these teachers one-on-one every 2 weeks, and we ask them a series of questions that actually they're best able to answer, not the technology. Are the students engaged in their learning? What are you observing? What's evidence of that they're mastering what they're learning? What's their work product look like? And finally, based on the data, what will you do next? How will you regroup the students over the next 2 weeks? What new strategies you will use? What existing strategies will you tweak? This enables them to prototype rapidly. Real-time data, rapid feedback, constant prototyping. These three things have enabled other industries to completely transform themselves. And this combination of daily feedback and bi-weekly sit-downs enables us to coach and mentor teachers over 100 times individually in a given school year. You'd have to be a professional athlete or a Hollywood actor to get that kind of coaching in your career. But that's where we're elevating the profession of teaching. That's how we take ordinary teachers and make them extraordinary. See, our hope is that in September, at the beginning of the school year, if we start these kids not at their age or grade level, but where they actually are academically, and move them through individual learning paths within small groups, within classrooms led by a teacher in a blended environment, we can see by June that some of these kids would make a year's worth of growth, some 2, some even 3. And let's face it, if these schools are that far behind, they have to make this kind of growth if they're ever going to catch up. But can it really work? Well, in Jalen School in our first year last year, we took assessment at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year and compared the 2 points to figure out what their growth was during that year. And what we found was 74% of those kids in reading and 83% of those kids in math made a gain of at least 10% or more. That's statistically significant because 10% represents at least a year's worth of learning within a single year. And then we looked at the data a little bit further on these kids. And what we found of those kids was 38% of those kids made a gain between 10 and 20%. 33% made a gain between 20 and 30%. And get this, 29% made a gain of greater than 30%. That's more than 3 years worth of learning in a single year. We wanted to bring the very best in blended school turnaround design to the very worst schools to create a powerful proof point at the very bottom that would serve as a proof point not only for the school and its community, but for the city, the state, and maybe even the nation. Our inspiration for this was Chuck Yeager. Chuck Yeager is a 1947 U.S. Air Force pilot. He was the first ever pilot to fly faster than the speed of sound. Prior to him, no one had ever broken the sound barrier. Chuck didn't have a faster plane or better technology or even better training. He had a belief, a conviction, that what everybody else said was impossible, he believed was possible. And his proof point was so powerful that after he did that, a generation of pilots after him attempted the same and succeeded because they then knew that it wasn't impossible. So much so that today, the sound barrier really isn't a barrier. It's routinely broken. What would happen within this unending sea of chronically failing schools, or turnaround schools as they're deemed? That within this sea of turnaround schools, we could create a few powerful proof points at the very bottom, those worst performing schools, and take these schools that are at the very bottom and in a 4 to 5 year period, enable them to become the very top with those same kids. We believe that those proof points can become tipping points that can reverse the trajectory of underperforming schools across the nation. But not just show a way to transform underperforming schools, but actually show a way to transform all schools and design a future of education that we all can be part of. It starts and ends with Jalen. You see, we believe that Jalen not only deserves to dream his dream, he deserves to realize his dream. And when we help Jalen realize his dream, he and his peers will help realize ours as a nation. Thank you.